Welcome to the Arthur Olsen Research Symposium. It's a great day, and we're happy that you're all here. And I also get to remind you that if you have one of these with you, if you wouldn't mind just taking a look at it, making sure that it is turned off or set to do not disturb or silent so that our phones don't interrupt our presenter. And then I also get to remind you that if you are a student seeking credit for your attendance in this session, you can come up to the front after the presentation, and I will stamp your program for this session. If you are in need of a program, we have programs and pens so that you can write your name on them up here as well. So those are my duties as the session chair. So now I also get to introduce you to Lindsey Romig. So please welcome her to the meeting.
Hi everybody, I'm Lindsey. I'm a senior anthropology major here at Augie. For my project, I focused on a subfield of forensic science, which is forensic odontology. And during the past semester and a half, I've been shadowing Dr. Snow, the Sioux Falls medical examiner. Before I get into that though, there is a little bit of background information I'd like to give. The textbook definition of forensic science is the application of the scientific method to the law. Because the field of forensic science is continually growing, there's a large number of subfields. Some of the fields include forensic anthropology, which I'll touch on a little, entomology, which is the study of insects, toxicology, which is the study of drugs and how they interact with our human body, and of course, forensic odontology. So there are lots of different people that are usually involved in forensics cases, and one person who's usually involved is the medical examiner. It's important to note that there's a difference between a coroner and a medical examiner, though. A coroner is a lay individual who is elected or appointed to certify deaths. A medical examiner is typically a physician with a little extra knowledge in death investigation, pathology, and forensic pathology. These individuals are also elected or appointed to certify deaths. They are experts in the human body and are able to notice abnormalities in it. Sometimes medical examiners are unable to determine the identity of an individual based on their face or fingerprints, so sometimes they have to use people's teeth. Because of their knowledge in human anatomy, they're able to look at the teeth of an individual and determine their identity through the process of comparison. Anthropologists are also sometimes involved in forensics cases. They are familiar with 4 subfields concerning humans, but in the biological subfield of anthropology, they study and become experts on the differences between human and animal remains, and you'd be surprised how often deer bones and bear bones end up in the morgue. I had an opportunity to observe Dr. Carlson helping Dr. Snell with a case a couple of years ago, where the police had brought in evidence bags filled with things that were found near some human remains, and she was able to go through the bags easily and determine the differences between human remains, deer remains, and rocks. You'd be surprised how they look sometimes. They can look kind of like bones. So, Dr. Carlson's focus, though, is not forensics. An anthropologist whose focus in forensics would be a biological anthropologist or a forensic anthropologist. These anthropologists are experts in, very specifically, the human skeleton. They're able to analyze the human remains, which are the results of unexplained deaths. When observing these remains, they're looking to determine the sex, age, height, and ancestry of an individual. They're also able to identify injuries on the bones and interpret them. They're familiar with the development of teeth, which is useful for age determination. An odontologist is even more specific and familiar with the development of teeth, the structure of teeth, and the degeneration of teeth. There are some patterns that can be observed in teeth. When they're looking for patterns for discussion purposes and labeling purposes, the most commonly used numbering system is the universal numbering system. It isn't the only numbering system used around the world, but it's the one that we use here in the US. For this system, you begin counting from your 3rd molar, which is your wisdom tooth, on your upper right jaw and move to the left, where you hop down to your lower jaw and continue counting the other way. Some more patterns that can be observed in teeth Deciduous teeth, which is the fancy term for baby teeth, and the formation of permanent teeth are useful when determining the age of an individual. The stages of development are known and are more useful in children than adults. In this first picture, we can see that children have fewer teeth than adults do, and we can see how the adult teeth form, or should form. By the time we're about 15 years old, we will have all but our wisdom teeth, which the majority of our population will get removed. In the second picture, there's a series of x-rays that show the progression of someone's teeth until they have their wisdom teeth removed. We can see in slides A and B that there are the buds of molars 1 and 2. After that, the third molar, or wisdom tooth, is beginning to form. And in H, we can see that it's been removed. We could technically also get an age estimate on older individuals based on the wear in their teeth over time. It's pretty near impossible to do this in our society today, though, because we emphasize good dental hygiene and regular dentist visits, so we don't see as much wear on the teeth. But if we didn't give as much attention to our teeth as we do, we would be able to get an age estimate. Before I get into the next little bit of information, I need to touch on the subject of race. The way that we think of race is usually the color of people's skin, which cannot actually be found in our DNA. It's simply melanin, which is a pigment that protects us from harmful UV light. Race itself is a cultural construct. When anthropologists discuss ancestry, we're discussing where on the physical planet did your ancestors live. We can see some ancestral markers, but we do need to keep in mind that they aren't always accurate. But with that said, I can move on to the next section. So some more patterns that you can see in teeth is ancestry. An example would be the Carabelli cusp, and that's that extra little bit there, and that's usually found in people of European descent. People of Asian descent you can usually find shovel-shaped incisors. Some other things that can be observed are diseases that show up on teeth. So one of them is hypodontia, which is the result of ectodermal dysplasia. You'll find missing teeth or peg teeth, and it's a hereditary X-linked trait. You may also see erosion of lingual surfaces, which are the backs of your teeth, due to things like eating disorders or alcoholism. The acidity of stomach contents causes the breakdown of those surfaces over time. But before anybody really looks at dentition, they have to determine if they even need to. Something that has an effect on the need to look at teeth for identification is decomposition. Depending on the environment that bodies are left in, they will decompose at different rates. For example, bodies in warm, moist environments will decompose faster than bodies in dry and hot environments. There are 5 stages to decomposition which have known rates. The first is fresh bodies, which have little to no discoloration of the skin and no insect activity. The bodies are usually 1 to 7 days old. The second stage is early decomposition. And in this stage, the flesh begins to have some discoloration, which can vary from a gray-green to a brown-black. The body will also be bloated. The next stage of decomposition is advanced decomposition, where we can see a caving of the abdominal cavity and extensive maggot activity. At this point, less than half of the skeleton is exposed. The fourth stage is skeletonization, where more than half of the skeleton is exposed. Some of the flesh and body fluids may still be present, and the bones are usually greasy to dry. And the final stage is in extreme decomposition, where we will see skeletonization with bleaching of bones and exfoliation and metaphyseal loss. So, during my time with Dr. Snell this semester and last, I had the opportunity to discuss some cases with him, which he needed to use dental records in order to identify the individual. In this case, a Jane Doe was discovered in a field with obvious burns. Both an external and an internal examination of the remains were completed, and the results of the examinations were obvious burns to the body, making it impossible to identify the individual by their face or fingerprints. There were no skull fractures or no traumatic fractures to the extremity bones either. The conclusions from these examinations were that the manner of death was homicide, but the cause of death couldn't be determined. I should take a minute to mention that the reason the victim was burned was because someone tried to dispose of the body, but you can't really dispose of a body in this way. When people are commercially cremated, the retort or the oven is heated to about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and it takes between 1.5 and 3 hours for that process to be completed. Even then, there's still things like teeth that last through that extreme heat. So coming back to the case now, since the victim couldn't be identified by their face or fingerprints, the next step was to try and identify the victim based on dental records. Dr. Snell was able to take x-rays of her teeth and found unique patterns such as root canals, which are the little extra white lines up in the teeth there, in her teeth. So before he received the correct dental records, Dr. Snell was given the records of a missing person who they thought could have been our Jane Doe. That's just a close-up of the root canals. So these are a comparison of the missing person's dental records, antemortem, and Jane Doe's dental records postmortem. We can see that Jane Doe has some caps and root canals that our missing person does not. They're able to determine that Jane Doe is not the missing person based on those dental records. Because they had a negative ID from those dental records, they collected deep breast tissue and sent it in for DNA testing. The testing results were a positive match, and because of this match, dental records were provided for comparison. Based on those comparisons of the antemortem dental records with the postmortem dental records, Jane Doe was positively identified. So, odontology isn't always required to identify remains, though. In fact, a majority of the cases that Dr. Snell works on don't require any odontology. In most of his cases, he's able to identify an individual based on their face or their fingerprints. There are usually more cases that don't need odontologists to be able to identify remains than those that do. The cases that do, though, especially those involving more than one individual, usually make the news. Some examples of cases where an odontologist might be necessary are mass disasters like plane crashes, tsunamis, hurricanes, or wartime events such as genocides, or even events closer to home like 9/11, when 596 individuals were positively identified based on dental records. To wrap up, forensic odontology is a very small field, and having an expert around isn't always necessary. When medical examiners and physical anthropologists are familiar with human dentition, and they can do basic identification of remains, time and resources can be saved. Thank you all for your attention. Do you have any questions? Give me a second to absorb that.